Hazel Hadfield did not know that the man standing in the doorway of the stone manor, watching her chase a bleeding lamb across his private meadow, was the Alpha King of the Eastern Realm. She did not know that the land beneath her muddy boots had been closed to outsiders for 3 years, or that the last person who had crossed the boundary wall without permission had been escorted out by a full patrol of royal wolves. All she knew was that the fog had swallowed the ridge path 2 hours ago, the lamb had bolted through a gap in a crumbling stone wall, and she was trespassing on someone's land with no idea whose. The meadow was enormous. That was the first thing that registered through the fog and the panic and the ache in her legs from climbing all morning. Wide and green, sloping gently toward a manor house that emerged from the mist like something out of a story she half remembered. Gray stone walls thick with ivy, tall windows dark with rain, a roof of slate tiles gone silver with lichen. The kind of house that had been built centuries ago by someone who wanted to disappear into the mountains and had largely succeeded. The lamb, a spindly thing with a crooked ear that Hazel had been bottle feeding since its mother rejected it 3 weeks ago, was trotting happily through the tall grass as though it had found paradise. It stopped to nibble at a patch of clover, utterly indifferent to the fact that it had led her across a boundary she could not see, into territory she did not recognize, on a morning so thick with fog that the mountains themselves had vanished. "Thistle," she hissed, crouching low, inching forward with her hands out. "Come here, you miserable creature." Thistle looked at her with mild disinterest and moved 3 steps further into the meadow. Hazel's cloak was soaked through. The heather-colored wool, which had been her mother's, hung heavy on her shoulders, and the tin shepherd's crook clasp at her throat had gone cold against her skin. Her boots squelched in the wet grass. Her hair, loose and heavy with rain, clung to her neck and jaw in dark auburn ropes. She looked, she was fairly certain, like something the mountain had chewed up and spat back out. She didn't notice the man until she was 20 paces from the house. He was leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, watching her, not with alarm or anger, which she might have expected from a landowner finding a stranger on his property. Not with the cold, territorial assessment she had learned to recognize from pack wolves who viewed every unfamiliar scent as a threat. He was watching her with something that looked, impossibly, like quiet fascination. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that spoke of physical work, not court training. His hair was brown, slightly curled, grown past his collar in a way that suggested he either didn't own a mirror or didn't care what one showed him. He wore a plain dark wool shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, dark trousers, and boots so caked with mud they might have been any color once. No insignia, no jewelry, no cloak or coat despite the rain. He looked like a groundskeeper, a farmer, someone who belonged to this land in the way that trees belong to it, rooted and permanent and unremarkable. Hazel froze. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, the words tumbling out in a rush. "I didn't mean to. The fog came down and my lamb got through the wall and I couldn't see the boundary markers. I'll get her and go. I'm sorry. I know I shouldn't be here." The man said nothing for a moment. His gaze moved from her face to the lamb, which had wandered close enough to sniff at his boot. He looked down at it. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the space where one might live if it were invited. He crouched slowly and held out his hand. Thistle, the traitor, walked directly to him and pressed her nose against his palm. "She's young," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to open spaces and long silences. 3 weeks. Hazel blinked. "How did you know?" "Still wobbly on the back legs, and she's looking for a teat every time she finds a warm hand." He scratched behind the lamb's crooked ear, and Thistle made a sound of pure contentment. Her mother rejected her. Wouldn't nurse, wouldn't let her close. Hazel swallowed. I've been feeding her by hand. She's mine now, I suppose, whether I wanted her or not." The man looked up at her. His eyes were blue, not the pale, sharp blue of ice or the dark blue of deep water, but the blue of a clear sky at the very end of a long day, warm and steady and edged with something that looked like recognition. Something happened in Hazel's chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with exertion or cold, or the rain soaking through her clothes. It bloomed behind her sternum like a coal being breathed back to life, spreading outward through her ribs, down into her stomach, up into her throat. The ground beneath her boots felt suddenly more solid, more real, as though the earth itself had shifted to hold her in place. She took a step back. The warmth dulled but didn't vanish. It stayed there, glowing faintly like embers banked beneath ash. "You're soaked through," the man said, straightening. He looked at the sky, which was nothing but gray. "This fog won't lift before nightfall. The ridge paths are dangerous in weather like this." "I'll manage. I've walked those paths since I was a girl." "In clear weather, when you can see the drop-offs." He studied her for a moment, and there was nothing predatory in it, nothing possessive or calculating. Just a man looking at a woman standing in the rain and making a simple assessment. "Stay as long as you like." The words landed strangely, heavier than they should have, as though they contained more rooms than the sentence could hold. "I can't impose," Hazel said. "You're not imposing. I'm offering." He stepped back from the doorway, opening the entrance. Warm air drifted out, carrying the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs and something underneath. Something wild and green and achingly familiar, like standing in a forest after the first hard rain. "There's a fire, dry clothes, a barn for your lamb." Thistle was already walking through the door. Hazel looked at the fog, which had thickened until the boundary wall had vanished entirely. She looked at the ridge, which she couldn't see at all. She looked at the man, who was waiting without pressure, without impatience, as though he had all the time in the world and intended to spend it exactly here. "Just until the fog lifts," she said. He nodded. "Just until the fog lifts." The inside of the manor was vast and quiet and filled with the particular kind of neglect that comes not from poverty but from solitude. Grand rooms with furniture draped in cloth. Hallways where the only footprints in the dust were his. A kitchen large enough to feed 30 that showed signs of feeding 1. He built up the fire in the main hall, a room of dark stone and tall windows and ceiling beams blackened with centuries of smoke, and brought her a wool blanket, a dry linen shirt that was far too large for her, and a bowl of soup that tasted of root vegetables and rosemary and patient simmering. Hazel sat by the fire and ate and tried not to stare at the room around her. The hearth was enormous, carved from a single slab of dark granite, and above it hung a shield bearing a crest she didn't recognize. Wolf's head, surrounded by mountain laurel. Old, faded, but clearly the kind of emblem that belonged to someone important. "You live here alone?" she asked. "Mostly." He sat across from her in a chair that looked like it had been built for a larger man or a different century. "There's a housekeeper who comes 3 days a week from the village below, Gwen. She keeps me from burning the place down. This is a lot of house for one person." "It is?" He said it without self-pity or explanation, just fact. Hazel pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The warmth from the fire was seeping into her bones, loosening the cold knots in her muscles, and the warmth in her chest. The other warmth, the one she couldn't explain, was growing stronger the longer she sat across from this man. It pulsed gently, like a second heartbeat, and when he shifted in his chair, she felt the ground beneath her settle more firmly, as though the stone floor itself was content. "I'm Hazel," she said, "from Fen Hollow. It's a village about 6 miles west over the ridge. I know Fen Hollow." Something flickered in his expression. "Sheep country." "Sheep country," she confirmed. "I tend a flock for the village elder. 18 ewes and whatever lambs survive the spring. She paused. That's not very interesting, is it? You'd be surprised what I find interesting. She looked at him over the rim of her bowl. You haven't told me your name. A pause. Brief. Almost invisible. But she caught it. The way his fingers stilled on the arm of his chair. The way his gaze dropped to the fire for half a breath before returning to her face. Duncan, he said. Duncan, she repeated. The name felt solid in her mouth, like stone, like something you could build on. Is this your family's land? It was my father's. And his father's before that. It's been in the family a long time. It's beautiful. She meant it. Even through the fog, even in the rain, the land had a quality she couldn't quite name. A rightness. As though every stone and tree and blade of grass was exactly where it was supposed to be. I felt it when I crossed the wall. Something in the ground, like it was alive. Duncan went very still. Most people don't feel that, he said quietly. Feel what? The land. He was looking at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. This estate sits on a ley line, an old one. The kind that was here before the first wolves built the first hall. Most people walk across it and feel nothing. Some feel a hum, like standing near a beehive. But you said the ground felt alive. Hazel's mouth went dry. Is that unusual? It's very unusual. His voice had dropped, gone rough at the edges. In my family's history, there are only two kinds of people who feel the land that way. Those who carry the bloodline of this estate, and those who are bonded to someone who does. The fire cracked. Sparks spiraled upward into the dark chimney. Hazel's pulse was hammering, and the warmth in her chest had become something else entirely, something that pulled, that yearned, that reached toward the man sitting across from her with a desperation she didn't understand. I should check on Thistle, she said abruptly, and stood, and the blanket fell from her shoulders, and she was out of the room before he could respond. The barn was old and solid, built of the same gray stone as the house. Thistle had found a pile of clean straw and was sleeping in it, perfectly content. Hazel stood in the doorway and pressed her hand to her chest and tried to breathe. She was being ridiculous. She was a shepherd from a tiny village in the highlands. She tended sheep. She gathered herbs for the village healer, old Maren, whose joints had stiffened too much for her to climb the slopes herself. She mended fences and delivered lambs and lived in a cottage the size of this barn's smallest stall. She was nobody. She had always been nobody. And the warmth in her chest would not stop. She pressed her forehead against the cool stone of the barn wall and closed her eyes, and the moment she did, she felt it more clearly. The pull. Not in her chest now, but in the ground, in the soles of her feet, as though the earth beneath her was reaching up through rock and root and soil to connect her to something vast and ancient and waiting. Stop it, she whispered to no one, to the land, to her own treacherous body, which was responding to a stranger's proximity with a certainty her mind refused to accept. She stayed in the barn until her breathing steadied. When she returned to the hall, Duncan had laid out more blankets near the fire and retreated to the far side of the room, as though he understood without being told that she needed distance. The fog's thicker, he said. You shouldn't try the ridge tonight. She looked at the windows. He was right. The glass showed nothing but gray, not even the shapes of trees. I'll sleep here, she said, gesturing to the blankets by the fire. I'll leave at first light. You're welcome to a proper room. There are a dozen empty ones. Here is fine. She needed the fire between them, needed the open space, the lack of walls, the ability to see the door. Old habits, survival instincts honed by years of living on the edges of pack territory, where a lone, unbonded woman was either invisible or prey. Duncan nodded. He didn't argue, didn't press. He simply said, "Good night, Hazel," and walked out of the hall, and she listened to his footsteps fade up the stairs, and she lay down by the fire with the blankets pulled to her chin and the warmth in her chest humming like a lullaby she didn't know the words to. She didn't sleep for a long time. The fog didn't lift the next day, or the day after. It sat on the mountain like a living thing, thick and patient, swallowing the paths and the walls and the world beyond the estate's boundaries. Hazel told herself she should leave anyway. She knew these mountains. She could navigate by memory, by the feel of the ground, by the way the wind moved through certain gaps between certain ridges. But she didn't leave. She told herself it was because of Thistle, who had settled into the barn as though she'd been born there. She told herself it was because old Moran had enough dried herbs to last another week, and the flock was in the lower pastures where the village boys could manage them. She told herself it was practical, reasonable, safe. She didn't tell herself the truth, which was that every morning when she walked out of the manor's front door and felt the ground hum beneath her feet, something inside her exhaled. Something that had been clenched tight for years, for her whole life, relaxed like a fist opening. Duncan gave her space. He was good at it, which made her suspect he'd had practice. He worked the land during the day, mending fences, clearing deadfall from the forest paths, repairing a section of stone wall that had collapsed near the north boundary. He worked with his hands and his back, and the kind of quiet, focused intensity that suggested this was not labor performed out of necessity, but out of need. As though the physical work was the only thing keeping something inside him still. She watched him. She couldn't help it. The way he moved through the estate with a tenderness that bordered on grief. The way he touched the walls of the house sometimes, absently. The way you'd touch the face of someone sleeping. The way he stood at the edge of the meadow at dusk and looked out at the mountains as though waiting for something that had stopped coming a long time ago. On the second evening, she found him in the kitchen, struggling with a loaf of bread that had gone wrong in every way bread could go wrong. "That's not how you knead dough," she said from the doorway. He looked up. There was flour on his jaw, and something that might have been the beginning of embarrassment in his expression. "Gwen usually handles this." "Gwen isn't here." Hazel crossed the kitchen, nudged him aside with her hip, which she realized too late was an act of startling familiarity for two people who had known each other less than 2 days, and began working the dough. "You're overworking it. The gluten's gone tight. Here." She folded the dough gently, pressed, turned. "Like this. You have to be patient with it." He stood beside her and watched. She could feel the heat of him, even through the oversized shirt she was still wearing because her own clothes were still drying by the fire. Her skin prickled everywhere his proximity touched it, which was everywhere, because proximity didn't require contact. It only required awareness. "Where did you learn to bake?" he asked. "My mother, before she passed." Hazel kept her hands moving, kept her eyes on the dough. "She used to say you could tell everything about a person by how they handled bread, whether they were patient, whether they listened to the dough, or tried to force it." "What does my bread tell you about me?" She looked up at him. He was closer than she'd realized, close enough that she could see the individual shades of blue in his eyes, the fine lines at their corners, the way his pupils had widened slightly in the warm kitchen light. "That you're trying very hard to take care of something," she said, "and you're not sure you know how." The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. "The bread," she added quickly. "I meant the bread." "Right," he said. "The bread." But his eyes said something else entirely. That evening they sat on the front steps of the manor and watched the fog shift across the meadow like a living thing. It moved in slow currents, thickening in the hollows, thinning near the tree line, and the last gray light of the day turned it silver. Hazel had her knees drawn to her chest, the blanket from the hall wrapped around her shoulders. Duncan sat beside her, not quite touching, maintaining the careful distance she'd established and he'd respected without question. but the gap between them hummed. She could feel it the way she felt the coming of rain, a pressure that wasn't quite physical, a knowing that lived in the body rather than the mind. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Whatever you had before this place?" He was quiet for a long time. A night bird called from the east wood, and something small rustled in the garden wall. "I miss my mother's voice," he said. "She used to sing in the mornings. Old songs. Mountain songs that don't have words anymore, just melodies that have been passed down so long nobody remembers what they were about." He paused. "I miss my father's hands. He could build anything. This wall, this step we're sitting on. He laid these stones when I was a boy." I handed him the mortar. Hazel's chest ached. Not the bond, or not only the bond. The ache of recognizing grief in someone else's voice because you carried the same weight in your own chest. "My mother used to braid my hair before bed," she said. She hadn't meant to say it. The words came out on their own, pulled by the gravity of his honesty. Every night, even when she was so tired she could barely keep her eyes open, she'd sit behind me and braid my hair and hum, and I'd fall asleep before she finished. Her throat tightened. After she died, I couldn't stand anyone touching my hair. For years. I kept it short because the length reminded me of her hands. And now? She touched the ends of her hair where it fell past her shoulders. Now I keep it long because the length reminds me of her hands. Duncan looked at her. The last of the light was almost gone, and his face was all shadow and warmth, and the blue of his eyes was dark now, the color of deep water at dusk. "Grief is strange," he said. "The same thing that destroys you becomes the thing that keeps you connected to what you lost. My village healer says grief is love with nowhere to go. Your village healer sounds wise. She's 83, and she still argues with the sheep." He almost smiled. She watched it happen, the slow softening around his eyes, the slight lift at the corner of his mouth, the way his whole face changed when the severity broke. "I'm glad you're here," he said quietly. Hazel looked at the fog, at the meadow she couldn't see, at the mountains that had vanished entirely, leaving only this house, this step, this man, this impossible warmth in her chest that would not go away. "So am I," she said, and meant it in ways she wasn't ready to examine. On the third morning, Gwen arrived. Hazel heard her before she saw her. A brisk knock at the kitchen door, the sound of boots being stamped clean, and then a voice that carried the authority of someone who had been running things long before anyone asked her to. "You've left the larder open again, and there's a lamb in the barn eating my best hay, and I swear on every ancestor who ever drew breath in these walls, if you've tried to bake bread again, I'll—" The voice stopped. Hazel looked up from the kitchen table where she'd been eating porridge she'd made herself because Duncan's porridge was, if possible, worse than his bread. Gwen stood in the doorway. She was a small, sturdy woman with gray-streaked dark hair pulled into a tight knot and sharp brown eyes that missed absolutely nothing. She wore a practical wool dress beneath a heavy apron, and she was staring at Hazel as though she'd found a unicorn sitting at the kitchen table. "Good morning," Hazel said. Gwen's gaze moved from Hazel to Duncan, who had appeared in the hallway behind her, and back to Hazel. Something shifted in her expression. Something that looked like shock dissolving into understanding, dissolving into something fierce and bright and almost tearful. "Well," Gwen said. She pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment, composed herself, and smoothed her apron. "Well then." She looked at Duncan. "Does she know?" "No," Duncan said. "Know what?" Hazel asked. Gwen opened her mouth. Duncan shook his head once, a small, sharp movement, and Gwen closed her mouth and looked at him with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and compassion. "Know that my bread is a war crime," Duncan said mildly. "Hazel's been kind enough not to say so." "Your bread is a war crime," Gwen confirmed. She crossed to the larder with the efficiency of a woman who had organized this kitchen since before Duncan was born and began pulling out supplies. "Sit down, both of you. I'll make breakfast, and someone is going to explain the lamb." Hazel explained the lamb. Gwen listened, nodded, and produced a breakfast of eggs and sausage and fresh bread that she'd brought from the village, and the three of them sat around the kitchen table, and Hazel felt something she hadn't felt in years, the warmth of a shared meal with people who seemed impossibly glad she was there. After Gwen left, Duncan found Hazel in the garden behind the house. It had been beautiful once, she could see that, the bones of careful design visible beneath years of wild growth. Climbing roses gone leggy and unruly, a stone path nearly swallowed by moss, a fountain in the center, dry, its basin filled with fallen leaves. "This was my mother's," Duncan said. He stood at the garden's edge with his hands in his pockets and that look on his face again, the one that held grief so quietly it was almost invisible. She designed it, planted every rose herself. When did she pass? 4 years ago, my father a year after. He couldn't. He stopped, tried again. He didn't know how to be in the world without her. The bond, when it breaks, it takes something fundamental. He lasted a year. Most don't last that long. Hazel's throat tightened. She understood suddenly why the house felt the way it did. Not abandoned, mourned. This was a man living inside his own grief, tending it the way she tended her flock, because it was the only thing left of something he'd loved. "You came here to be alone," she said. "I came here because the alternative was unbearable." What was the alternative? He looked at her. The blue of his eyes was impossible in the gray garden light. Pretending. She took a step toward him. The ground hummed under her feet, and the warmth in her chest surged, and she didn't step back this time. She stood close enough to feel the heat of his body, close enough to smell wood smoke and rain and that wild green scent underneath. And she looked up at him, and the pull between them was so strong it felt like the mountain was leaning. "I feel it," she whispered. "The ground, the warmth. I don't understand what it means." "I think you do." "I'm a shepherd, Duncan. I live in a one-room cottage. I own 18 sheep and a rejected lamb and a tin pendant my mother gave me. That's the whole of what I am." "That's the whole of what you have." His voice was rough. "It's not what you are." "What am I then?" He lifted his hand. His fingers hovered near her jaw, not touching, the way he'd approached the lamb that first day. Slow, careful, giving her every chance to pull away. She didn't pull away. His fingers brushed her jaw, and the world cracked open. The ground sense, the warmth, the pull, it all collapsed into a single point of contact where his skin met hers. A sound filled her ears, low and resonant, like the mountain itself was humming a note it had held for centuries. Her wolf, which had been quiet and cautious inside her for so long she'd almost forgotten it was there, surged forward with a recognition so fierce it buckled her knees. Duncan's other hand caught her waist, held her steady. His eyes were blazing, the blue of them consumed by something vast and ancient and terrified. "I felt you cross the wall," he said, and his voice cracked on it. 3 days ago, I was sitting in the study and I felt the land shift, like a door opening, like something that had been missing for a very long time finally coming home." Hazel pressed her hand flat against his chest. His heart was hammering beneath her palm. "You didn't tell me." "I couldn't." He swallowed hard. "I couldn't say it without explaining everything else, and if I explained everything else, you would leave. And I—" Another crack in his voice. "I didn't want you to leave. What do you need to explain?" He stepped back, gently, carefully, as though separating from her cost him something physical. He ran both hands through his hair, and she watched the effort it took him to compose himself, to pull the grief and the want, and the overwhelming bond pull back inside the careful walls he'd built around them. Come with me, he said. He led her to the study, a room of dark wood and tall bookshelves and a desk covered in maps she recognized. Border maps, territory maps, the kind of maps that only someone with authority over vast amounts of land would need. Duncan opened a drawer and pulled out a circlet. Tin, dark and burnished, set with a single jet stone. He held it in his hands and looked at it the way you'd look at a wound that had never quite healed. My name is Duncan Cairnholm, he said, Alpha King of the Eastern Realm. I've been here for 3 years. I left the court after my parents died because the throne felt like a coffin and the crown felt like chains, and I couldn't breathe in any room that expected me to be something other than what I am, which is a man who lost everything and didn't know how to stop losing it. The words hit Hazel like cold water. Alpha King, the Alpha King. The ruler whose absence had been whispered about in every village from the coast to the mountain border. The king who vanished. The king they said had gone mad with grief, or been killed in secret, or simply walked into the mountains and never come back. He was standing in front of her in a mud-stained shirt with flowers still on his collar, holding a crown he clearly hated, and looking at her with eyes that begged her not to run. You're the king, she said. Yes. You've been here, this whole time, while my realm has advisors, a council, a court that functions perfectly well without me, arguably better without me, because a grieving king makes poor decisions and I had the sense to know it. His jaw tightened. I didn't abandon them. I delegated. But I couldn't be what they needed me to be. Not then. And now? Now? He set the circlet down on the desk. Now a shepherd walked across my boundary wall chasing a lamb with a crooked ear, and the land that hasn't spoken to me in 3 years woke up and started singing. Hazel stared at him. The warmth in her chest was a roar now, a bonfire, and every nerve in her body was singing the same note the ground had been humming since she first set foot on this estate. She turned and walked out of the room. She made it to the front door before he caught up. Not touching her. Just present. Standing behind her in the hallway with 3 centuries of stone and silence between them and a bond that was making it impossible to think clearly. Hazel. I'm a shepherd. Her voice was shaking. I tend sheep. I bake bread. I bring dried foxglove to an old woman who can't climb hills anymore. That's my life. That's what I am. I can't. I don't belong in a king's world. I don't belong anywhere near a crown or a court or any of this. I'm not asking you to belong near a crown. Then what are you asking? I'm asking you to stay. The word. That word. Stay. It hit her with the force of everything she'd never been offered. Her mother had died when Hazel was 14, and no one had asked her to stay then. She'd been passed from household to household, useful enough to keep, never valued enough to want. She'd found her way to Fen Hollow and Old Maren and the sheep because they needed tending. And tending was the only language she spoke fluently, and no one had ever, not once, looked at her and said stay, not because of what she could do, but because of who she was. I have responsibilities, she whispered. Maren needs her medicines. The flock needs tending. The village depends on me. Then I'll help you tend them. She turned. He was standing 3 feet away, and his expression was stripped of everything. Every wall, every guard, every careful structure he'd built to survive 3 years of solitude. He was just a man, standing in his own hallway, asking a woman not to leave. You're the king, she said. I'm the man who's been alone in this house for 3 years, and you're the first person who's made it feel like anything other than a tomb. His voice broke. I don't care about the crown, Hazel. I care that when you walked across my land, the ground sang. I care that my wolf, which has been silent since my father died, is pressing against my skin right now trying to get to you. I care that you're standing in my doorway, and every instinct I have is screaming that if you walk through it, Something irreplaceable goes with you. Hazel's eyes burned, she blinked, and tears spilled down her cheeks, warm and sudden and unstoppable. I don't know how to do this, she said. Neither do I. He took one step closer. But I know how to tend things. Fences, walls, land. Bread, apparently. With supervision. The ghost of humor, fragile and real. Let me tend this. Let me tend us. Not as a king. Just as the man whose floor you slept on and whose terrible cooking you endured for 3 days. She laughed. It came out broken and wet, but it was real, and the sound of it did something to his face that she would remember for the rest of her life. It softened him. It cracked the grief wide open and let something new grow through the fissure. Just until the fog lifts, she said, echoing words that had already become something else entirely. Just until the fog lifts, he agreed. He kissed her. It was not the careful, tentative kiss of two strangers finding their way to each other. It was the kiss of two people who had been alone for too long and had finally, impossibly, found the thing that made solitude unbearable in retrospect. His hands came up to frame her face, rough and warm, calloused from 3 years of working land he loved, and his mouth found hers with a certainty that made her knees give way. The ground sense exploded. The humming became a chord, deep and resonant, and Hazel felt it travel up through her bones and settle in her chest where the warmth had been waiting. Her wolf surged forward, not cautious now, not quiet, howling silently against the inside of her skin with a joy so fierce it blurred her vision. She gripped his shirt with both hands and kissed him back, and he made a sound against her mouth, low and raw and reverent, and his arms wrapped around her, pulling her against his chest, and she could feel his heartbeat against her own, and they were the same. Rhythm for rhythm, beat for beat. When they broke apart, his forehead dropped to hers. His breathing was ragged. His hands were trembling where they held her face. The fog, he said roughly, might take a while to lift. It might, she agreed. Weeks, possibly. Months. His thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, catching a tear she hadn't noticed. I'll need someone to teach me how to bake bread. You'll need more than bread. I'll need everything. He kissed her forehead, her temple, the bridge of her nose. I'll need you, if you'll have me, crown and grief and all the rest of it. I'll have you, Hazel said, but I'm bringing my sheep. He laughed. The sound was rusty and unpracticed and beautiful, and it echoed through the stone hallway of the manor that had been silent for 3 years, and the house drank it in like dry ground drinking rain. They had 4 days before the world came looking for him. 4 days of quiet mornings and long walks across the estate. 4 days of Hazel teaching Duncan to bake bread that didn't qualify as a weapon. 4 days of his hand finding hers as they walked the boundary wall together, their wolves running side by side in that internal space where the bond was rewriting everything they'd believed about themselves. The ground sense deepened. Hazel felt it constantly now, the living pulse of the land beneath her feet. Stronger when Duncan was near, softer when he walked to the far fields, never gone entirely. It was as though the estate itself had claimed her, as though the soil recognized something in her blood that she didn't know was there. On the first morning after the kiss, Hazel woke before dawn and went to the garden. The roses Duncan's mother had planted were wild and overgrown, their canes tangled into knots that had been left to their own will for years. But beneath the neglect, the roots were strong. The wood was green when she scratched it with her thumbnail. These plants were surviving on nothing but stubbornness and good soil, and she understood them perfectly. She was cutting back dead wood when Duncan found her, 2 cups of tea in his hands, the circlet conspicuously absent, sleep still softening his face. He handed her a cup and sat on the low wall and watched her work without speaking. The bond hummed between them, warm and unhurried, and the silence felt like a language they were both fluent in. "You know how to prune roses," he said eventually. "I know how to prune everything. Roses, sheep, people who ask too many questions before the sun comes up." She cut a crossing cane and pulled it free, tossing it onto the pile. "These are beautiful. Or they were. They could be again." "My mother would have liked you." Hazel's hands stilled on the shears. The sentence was simple, but the weight of it pressed against her ribs like a hand placed flat on her chest. She looked at him over her shoulder, and his face was open and raw, and the grief in his eyes had transformed into something else. Not gone, never gone, but softened into gratitude, into the recognition that love didn't end when the person who carried it was no longer there to hold it. "I would have liked her," Hazel said. On the third evening, he shifted. They were walking the north boundary when it happened. The sun had dropped behind the mountains and the air turned cold and sharp, carrying the scent of pine resin and stone and the distant sweetness of alpine flowers. Hazel felt the change before she saw it. A tremor through the ground beneath her feet, a surge in the bond so powerful it made her gasp. And then Duncan was gone, and in his place stood a wolf. He was enormous, dark brown, the color of mountain earth after rain, with blue eyes that burned like cold fire. His fur was thick and rough, the coat of an animal that had been wild too long, and he stood perfectly still in the last light, looking at her. Hazel's wolf pressed against the inside of her skin so hard it ached. Not to shift, not yet, but to be close. To answer the call that was resonating through every fiber of the bond like a struck bell. She walked toward him, slowly, her hand outstretched the way she'd approach a lamb that didn't trust her yet. His wolf lowered its massive head and pressed its muzzle into her palm. The fur was coarse and warm. His breath was hot against her wrist. And the sound that came from his throat was not a growl, but a whine, soft and broken and full of everything 3 years of silence had held. "I know," she whispered. She sank to her knees in the grass and wrapped her arms around his neck and pressed her face into the thick fur of his ruff. And the wolf shuddered, his whole body shaking, and his head came around to rest against her shoulder. They stayed like that until the stars came out. On the second evening, Duncan told her about the court, about the advisors who sent letters he didn't open, about the council that governed in his absence, competent but frustrated, holding the realm together with the political equivalent of string and stubbornness, about the delegation that had been threatening to come find him for months. "They think I've lost my mind," he said. They were sitting on the garden wall, watching the sun set through a rare break in the clouds. The sky was amber and rose, and the mountains beyond the estate were painted in gold. "Maybe I have. You haven't lost your mind. You lost your parents. The mind sometimes takes a while to find its way back." He looked at her. "You say things like that, and I forget you're a shepherd." "I'm a shepherd who reads." She bumped her shoulder against his. "Marin has books. Hundreds of them. She was a scholar before her joints betrayed her. She taught me that grief isn't madness. It's love with nowhere to go." His hand found hers on the wall. The bond hummed. "Gwen told me you haven't shifted in 3 years," Hazel said carefully. "Since your father." The wolf went quiet when the bond broke. When his mate, my mother, died, and then when he followed. The wolf is tied to the bloodline, to the land. When my father died, it felt like... He paused. Like the ground went silent, like the thing that had always been alive beneath my feet just stopped. But it's not silent now. No. He turned her hand over in his, traced the lines of her palm with one finger. "It started singing the moment you crossed the wall." "Duncan." She tightened her grip on his hand. "You need to go back." The silence that followed was heavy. "I know," he said finally. "The realm needs its king. You can't stay here forever. I know. He brought her hand to his lips, pressed a kiss to her knuckles. But I'm not going back alone. On the 5th morning, they came. Hazel heard the horses before she saw them. The drumming of hooves on the mountain path, the jingle of bridles and armor, the organized sound of people who moved with purpose and authority. She was in the garden, pruning the roses Duncan's mother had planted when they crested the ridge. A delegation of 12. Riders in formal cloaks bearing the Cairnholm crest. The wolf's head and mountain laurel she'd seen on the shield above the fireplace. At their head rode a tall woman in a coat of dark green wool with silver clasps, and beside her, a man in the gray robes of a council elder. Duncan was in the meadow. He straightened from the fence post he'd been repairing and watched them approach, and Hazel saw the transformation happen in real time. The soft, unhurried man she'd been sharing meals with and teaching to bake and kissing in hallways, he didn't disappear. But something settled over him like armor, something old and heavy and unavoidable. The delegation stopped in the courtyard. The woman dismounted first. 3 years, she said. Her voice was flat. 3 years, and when we finally find you, you're mending a fence. The fence needed mending, Iadra. The realm needs its king. The realm has survived. Survived isn't the same as thrived, and you know it. Idra pulled a scroll from her saddlebag. The border disputes with the southern reach have escalated. The trade routes through the mountain passes need renegotiating, and there are 4 territorial alphas who have been making claims on unclaimed land that falls under crown jurisdiction. She held out the scroll. You've been gone long enough, Duncan. It's time. Duncan took the scroll. He didn't open it. He looked at the delegation, at the horses, at the banners bearing his family crest, and Hazel saw the weight of it settle onto his shoulders like something physical. Then Idra's gaze found Hazel. The change was immediate. Idra's nostrils flared. Her eyes widened. She looked at Hazel, looked at Duncan, and then looked at the ground between them with an expression of stunned comprehension. The land, Idra breathed. It's awake. I felt it the moment we crossed the boundary. The ley line, it's... She turned to Duncan. You found your mate. The word rippled through the delegation. Heads turned. Eyes found Hazel where she stood in the garden with rose clippings in her hands and dirt on her knees and an oversized linen shirt that belonged to the king. Hazel's stomach dropped. Who is she? The council elder asked, stepping forward. His voice was the voice of a man who weighed everything on a scale of political advantage. What house? What bloodline? Her name is Hazel Hadfield, Duncan said. She's a shepherd from Fenhollow. The silence was excruciating. A shepherd, the elder repeated. A shepherd. Duncan's voice was calm, but Hazel could hear the steel beneath it. She walked across my boundary wall 5 days ago chasing a lost lamb, and the land that had been dead since my father's passing came back to life. The ley line recognized her. My wolf recognized her. I recognized her. The council will need to verify the bond, the elder began. The council can verify whatever it likes. The bond is not contingent on their approval. Hazel set down the rose clippings. Her hands were shaking. The warmth in her chest was screaming at her to cross the garden and stand beside him, but her legs wouldn't move because the truth of what she'd been pretending she could ignore was standing in the courtyard, wearing formal cloaks and carrying the weight of a kingdom. She didn't belong here. She had always known that. She was a shepherd. She had 18 sheep and a cottage she could cross in 4 strides, and a life that was small and useful and hers. She didn't know how to be anything else. She turned and walked into the house. She was packing her satchel when he found her. The dry shirt he'd lent her, folded neatly on the bed. The bowl she'd eaten from, washed and returned to its shelf. The blankets by the fire, stacked with the careful precision of someone who had been trained from childhood to leave no trace, to make herself invisible, to be easily forgotten. Her hands moved through the motions of leaving the way they moved through the motions of shearing or mending fences, or any of the 1,000 small tasks she used to keep herself from thinking too hard about the shape of her life. Pack the satchel, tie the cloak, check the boots. Don't look at the kitchen where she'd taught him to knead dough. Don't look at the garden where his mother's roses were beginning to bloom under her hands. Don't look at anything too long, because looking was the same as wanting, and wanting was the same as staying, and staying was impossible for a girl like her. Her wolf howled inside her, not with sound, with feeling. A tearing sensation behind her sternum, as though the bond was a physical thread and she was walking away from the spool. Each step toward the door pulled it tighter, and the ground beneath her feet, the ground that had been singing for 5 days, the ground that had recognized her before she recognized herself, went cold. That was what almost broke her. The silence of the earth, the sudden absence of humming, as though the land itself knew she was leaving and had already begun to grieve. Hazel. He stood in the doorway. He'd put on the circlet. The tin band with the jet stone sat against his brow, and it changed him. Not his face, not his eyes, but the space he occupied. He was larger with it on. He was a king. And beside a king, a shepherd was just a shepherd. Just a girl with dirt on her boots and nobody's blood in her veins. "I need to go back to Fen Hollow," she said. Her voice was steady, but only because she was holding it with both hands. "Marin needs her foxglove. The flock needs tending. I've been gone too long already. Hazel. Thank you for your hospitality, and for the bread lessons." She attempted a smile. It failed. "You're still terrible at kneading, but the oven temperature was closer this time. You're running. I'm leaving. There's a difference." There isn't. He crossed the room, and he was just Duncan again. Flour on his collar, mud on his boots, blue eyes full of everything he'd spent 3 years trying not to feel. "Don't do this." "Do what? Accept reality?" She pulled the satchel's strap over her shoulder. "You're the Alpha King. You need a queen who can stand beside you in a court and negotiate treaties and host delegations of people who look at bloodlines before they look at faces. You don't need a shepherd. I don't need a queen. The realm does. The realm needs someone who makes the land sing." He caught her hand. The bond blazed between them, and she gasped, and her wolf keened inside her, a sound of protest so raw it hurt. "Hazel, the ley line was dead. For 3 years. The ground was silent. The wolves on this mountain wouldn't come near the estate. The birds stopped nesting in the east wood. The land was grieving with me, and then you walked across a wall chasing a lamb, and everything came back. That's not me. That's the bond. The bond is you. You are the bond. They're the same thing." He pulled her closer, and his free hand came up to cup the side of her face, and she let him, because denying the pull was like denying gravity, possible in theory, devastating in practice. "I spent 3 years in this house telling myself I could survive alone, and I could. But surviving isn't living, Hazel. You told me that. In the kitchen. Over terrible bread." She was crying again. She hated it. She was not a person who cried. She was a person who endured, who tended, who kept her head down, and her hands busy, and her heart locked in a chest she'd buried so deep she'd forgotten where she put the key. "I don't know how to be seen," she whispered. "I've spent my whole life making sure no one sees me because every time someone sees me, they see something they don't want. I see you." He pressed his forehead to hers. "I see you, and I want everything. Duncan. Stay." His voice broke on the word. "Stay. Not because the bond tells you to. Not because the land recognizes you. Not because a king is asking. Stay because a man who hasn't laughed in 3 years started laughing again because you told him his bread was a war crime. Stay because you taught my dead garden to grow roses again. Stay because you're the first person who's walked into this house and made it feel like home since the day my mother died. Hazel closed her eyes. Tears slid down her cheeks and over his fingers and onto the stone floor, and she felt them sink into the ground, and the ground hummed. She dropped the satchel. "I'm bringing my sheep," she said. "All 18? And the lamb. Especially the lamb." He kissed her. Soft and slow and tasting of tears and bread and the wild green scent that had been pulling her toward him since the first moment she stepped onto this land. Especially the lamb. She kissed him back, and the bond settled between them like roots finding water, deep and patient and permanent. The tin pendant around her neck pressed warm between their chests. His heartbeat was steady beneath her palm. The house creaked around them, old bones settling, and it sounded like contentment. In the courtyard, Idra was still waiting. Duncan walked out with Hazel at his side, his hand in hers, the circlet on his brow. The delegation straightened. The elder started to speak. "My mate returns with me to court," Duncan said, "along with her flock. Arrangements will be made for her village healer to receive regular supply runs from the crown stores. The rest of the delegation can ride ahead. We'll follow in 2 days." 2 days, Idra said. "We have bread to finish." Adra looked at Hazel. Her expression was unreadable for a long moment, and then something softened in it. Something that looked like recognition. Not of rank or bloodline, but of the thing that mattered more. "The land is alive again," Idra said quietly. "I haven't felt the ley line this strong in years." She inclined her head toward Hazel. "Whatever you are, the mountain knows your name." Hazel said nothing. She stood in the courtyard of a king's estate in borrowed clothes with dirt under her fingernails and a tin pendant around her neck and a bond humming in her chest, and she felt the ground beneath her feet, warm and steady and alive, and she thought, "This is what it feels like to stop running. This is what it feels like to stay." 3 months later, Hazel stood in the garden that Duncan's mother had planted and watched the roses bloom. She had pruned them herself, cut back the dead wood, cleared the moss from the stone paths, rebuilt the fountain with Duncan's help, and a great deal of creative profanity. The garden had come back the way everything on this estate came back. Slowly, stubbornly, and then, all at once. The court had not known what to do with her. A shepherd queen, they whispered. A commoner with dirt in her blood and a flock she refused to sell. She'd heard the whispers and let them roll off her like rain off wool, because she'd spent a lifetime being underestimated and it no longer stung. The land knew her name. That was enough. Duncan found her there. He always found her in the garden when the sun was low and the light turned everything to amber. He'd changed in 3 months. The grief was still there. She could feel it through the bond, a quiet ache that she suspected would never fully leave, but it had transformed into something gentler. Memory instead of wound. Love instead of loss. He wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder. His breath was warm against her ear. "Gwen says you've been teaching the kitchen staff to bake," he said. "Someone had to. Your castle's bread was almost as bad as yours. My bread has improved. Your bread is adequate. That's the kindest word I have for it." He laughed, and the sound was easy now. Practiced. Something his face remembered how to do. The garden swallowed the sound and gave it back warmer. "A letter came from Fenhollow," he said. "Marin says the new supply route is working. She's getting fresh herbs weekly now instead of whenever you could climb the mountain." Hazel smiled. She'd negotiated that supply route herself, standing in the council chamber in a dress she still wasn't comfortable wearing, and argued for it with the same stubborn patience she'd used to convince lambs to nurse and bread to rise, and a grieving king to come back to the world. The council had listened. They were learning to listen. "And Thistle?" she asked. "Terrorizing the royal flock." The head shepherd says she's the most opinionated ewe he's ever encountered. She learned from the best. Duncan pressed a kiss behind her ear. Through the bond she felt his contentment, warm and steady, like the ground sense that had become so natural she forgot it wasn't how everyone experienced the world. The land hummed beneath her feet. The roses swayed in the evening breeze. Somewhere beyond the garden wall, the mountain stood ancient and patient and gold in the dying light. "Do you remember what you said to me?" Duncan murmured. "That first day, when I told you to stay." I said, "Just until the fog lifts." "The fog lifted months ago." She turned in his arms. His face was all warm stone and blue sky, the face of a man who had walked into the dark and found his way back by following a thread he hadn't known existed until a shepherd stumbled across his land and woke it up. "It did," she said. She kissed him, soft and sure and tasting of rosemary and home. "But I'm still here." He held her in the garden his mother had built, in the house his family had raised from stone and stubbornness and love, on the land that had chosen her the moment she crossed the wall. The tin pendant at her throat caught the last of the sunlight and burned like a small, bright star. And the ground sang.